Welcome to the Frontline Voices. Before we begin this tale from the old frontier, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button. In 1887, blacksmith Thomas Reid had worked the same forge for 30 years, but when a mysterious stranger brought a broken sword to repair, Thomas discovered it wasn't made of any metal he knew. The weapon held memories of battles never recorded in history, and fixing it would either save his dying town or damn it forever. Millbrook was dying. The silver mine had played out 2 years ago, the railroad had passed them by, and folks were leaving every month for California or back east. Thomas Reid's blacksmith shop, once the busiest place in town, now saw maybe one customer a week. 30 years he'd worked that forge. 30 years of horseshoes, wagon repairs, and farm tools. His hands knew every hammer strike, every angle of the anvil. But business was so slow now that Thomas was considering packing up himself. That changed on October 15th, 1887. The stranger rode into town just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows down Main Street. Tall man, wore a dark coat despite the heat, and sat his horse like he'd been riding for a very long time. His face was weathered but ageless somehow, like old leather that never quite cracked. Thomas was closing up shop when the stranger tied his horse to the post outside. "You the blacksmith?" the stranger asked. "Thomas Reid. Been smithing here 30 years." The stranger nodded slowly. "Heard you're good with metals, all kinds of metals." "I work iron mostly. Some steel when I can get it." "Why?" The stranger reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in oiled leather. When he unwrapped it, Thomas's breath caught. It was a sword, but unlike any he'd ever seen. The blade was broken clean through about halfway up, but even damaged, it was beautiful. The metal had a strange shimmer to it, like oil on water, and seemed to hold light even in the dimming workshop. "Can you fix it?" the stranger asked. Thomas picked up the pieces carefully. The metal was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been after being in a saddlebag all day. And it was light. Far lighter than steel, but when he tapped it with his finger it rang like a bell. "What kind of metal is this?" "Old kind," the stranger said. "Older than this country. Older than most countries." Thomas held the broken pieces up to the lamplight. The break was clean, would join easily enough. But the metal itself, he'd never worked anything like it. "I can try," Thomas said, "but I can't promise anything. Never seen metal like this." "You'll figure it out," the stranger said. "You're the only smith in 300 miles who can." "How do you know that?" The stranger smiled, and for a moment his eyes seemed much older than his face. "Because this blade's been waiting for you, Thomas Reid. Waiting 30 years. Before Thomas could ask what that meant, the stranger placed a leather pouch on the workbench. It clinked with the sound of gold coins. "That's for trying. There'll be more when it's finished." "How long you staying in town?" "Until the work's done." The stranger left then, leading his horse toward the hotel. Thomas stood in his workshop holding pieces of impossible metal and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. That night, Thomas studied the sword by lamplight. The metal was beautiful, but there was something else. When he held the pieces together, fitting the break, he could swear he heard whispers, faint voices speaking words in no language he recognized. He set the pieces on his workbench and tried to sleep, but the whispers continued. Not loud enough to understand, just present, like distant conversation in another room. The next morning, Thomas fired up his forge and began to work. The metal behaved unlike anything he'd ever encountered. It heated too quickly, cooled too slowly, and when he tried to hammer it into shape, it seemed to guide his strikes. The sword wanted to be repaired, was helping him repair it. As he worked, the whispers grew stronger, and Thomas began to understand them. They were voices of warriors, men who had carried this blade into battles across centuries. He heard names of wars that weren't in any history book, saw flashes of conflicts fought in places that didn't exist on any map. The blade had been forged in a time before time, carried by heroes whose names were lost to legend. It had cut through darkness that threatened to swallow the world, had been broken defending people who would never know they'd been saved. And now it was here, in his little dying town, waiting to be made whole again. Thomas worked for 3 days straight, barely stopping to eat or sleep. The sword guided him, showed him how to rejoin the metal, how to restore its edge. When he finally quenched the completed blade in his water trough, steam rose like incense. The sword was perfect. More than perfect, it was alive. That evening, the stranger returned. "It's finished," Thomas said, holding out the weapon. The stranger took the sword reverently, testing its balance, running his finger along the edge. The metal sang at his touch, a pure note that seemed to resonate through the entire workshop. "Beautiful work, Thomas Reid. But then, you always were the finest smith in 7 territories. I've never been more than 50 miles from this town." The stranger smiled that ageless smile again. "Not yet." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, the stranger pointed the sword toward the window. "Look outside, Thomas." Thomas looked out onto Main Street and gasped. The dying town of Millbrook was gone. In its place stood a thriving community. Electric lights glowed in shop windows, automobiles moved down paved streets, and people in strange clothes walked past buildings that hadn't been there an hour ago. "What's happening?" "You fixed more than a sword, Thomas. You fixed a timeline. This blade has been protecting this place for longer than you know, keeping darkness at bay. When it was broken, Millbrook began to die. Now that it's whole again, the town lives. The town thrives. For the next 150 years, Millbrook will be home to inventors, artists, and dreamers. Technologies will be developed here that will change the world. All because one blacksmith knew how to forge hope back into an ancient blade." Thomas stared out at the transformed town, then back at the stranger. "Who are you?" "I'm the guardian of this blade. Have been for 800 years, will be for 800 more. I travel through time, following the sword, making sure it gets to where it needs to be when it needs to be there." "And where does it need to be now?" The stranger sheathed the sword and picked up the leather pouch, now much heavier than before. "Right here, in your capable hands." "I don't understand." "The sword chooses its guardians, Thomas. It chose you 30 years ago, guided your life to this moment. You've been training for this your entire life without knowing it." Thomas felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "What do I have to do?" "What you've always done. Work metal, help people. But now you'll be working with purpose. This forge will become legendary. Weapons made here will defend the innocent. Tools created here will build wonders. And when the time comes, you'll pass the knowledge on to someone else." The stranger handed Thomas the pouch and an ancient book bound in leather. "Everything you need to know is in there. The real history of metals, the songs that shape steel, the prayers that give strength to iron." Thomas opened the book carefully. The pages were covered with diagrams, formulas, and text in a dozen languages, including several he'd never seen but somehow understood. "The sword will stay here," the stranger continued, "hidden but close. When darkness threatens Millbrook again, and it will, the blade will be ready. When will that be?" "Sooner than you'd like. There are forces that don't want this town to prosper, don't want the innovations that will come from here to reach the world. They'll send agents, create obstacles, try to recreate the dying timeline. How will I know them? You'll know. The sword will warn you, and when the time comes, you'll be ready." The stranger mounted his horse and tipped his hat. "Thank you, Thomas Reid. You've saved more lives than you'll ever know. Will I see you again? When you need me most." The stranger rode out of town as mysteriously as he'd arrived, leaving Thomas standing in his transformed workshop with a book of impossible knowledge and the weight of protecting an entire future. That night, Thomas hid the sword beneath his forge, wrapped in the same oiled leather. He could feel its presence there, warm and patient, waiting for whatever came next. Over the following months, Millbrook attracted new residents, inventors, craftsmen, scholars, all drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Thomas's forge became the heart of the growing community, turning out tools and devices that seemed almost magical in their precision and durability. And sometimes, late at night when the forge fires burned low, Thomas could still hear the whispers. Not from the past now, but from the future. Voices of gratitude from people not yet born, thanking him for fixing more than just a broken sword. Thomas Reid had saved his town by learning to forge hope itself. Did this story make you believe in the power of preserving the past to build the future? Do you think some objects carry the weight of destiny? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe tales of timeless guardians and ancient purposes need to be heard, don't forget to follow the Frontline Voices.